You know how in every neighborhood, there is that one house that feels a little different? The one where the lights stay on too late, or the curtains never seem to close? In the spring of 2002, in a quiet suburb of Cleveland, Ohio, that house belonged to a single father named David Lerner. David had a habit that his neighbors found strange but harmless. Every night, after putting his 8-year-old daughter to bed, he would sit in his living room with every curtain wide open, the television off, just sitting there in the glow of the streetlights until the early hours of the morning. And for months, a teenager named Marcus, who walked home from his girlfriend's house past midnight, would see David sitting there, alone in his bright cage of windows. And then one night, Marcus saw something else. He saw a second shadow moving behind David. He saw a struggle. He saw David fall. And when he called the police, no one believed him because David answered the door the next morning, alive and well, insisting that nothing had happened. The family moved away a month later, and the new owners, they found something behind those curtains that no one had ever thought to look for.
If you made it this far, you are the kind of person who actually looks at the windows. So do me a favor, hit subscribe. Not because I asked, because there are more stories behind curtains you have not opened yet.
The neighborhood was called Willow Ridge, the kind of planned community that sprouted across the American Midwest in the late 90s, with identical mailboxes and manicured lawns, and houses so close together that you could hear your neighbor's phone ringing. David Lerner had moved there in 1999 with his wife and daughter, but his wife left less than a year later, and after that, it was just David and Emily, a quiet 8-year-old with braids and a habit of waving at every car that passed. David worked from home as a software consultant, which meant he was always around but never really outside. His lawn was always a little too long, his porch light always burned out, but he was polite, never loud, never caused trouble, and in a neighborhood like Willow Ridge, that was enough. The thing that made David different, the thing that everyone noticed, was the curtains. Every other house on the block had their blinds drawn by 9 o'clock, the suburban signal that the day was over and privacy had begun. But David's living room curtains stayed open all night, every night. The room was bright, lit by a single floor lamp with a yellow shade, and through the large front window, you could see the blue couch, the wooden coffee table, the stack of children's books on the shelf, and David himself, sitting in the armchair by the window, facing the street, doing nothing. No book, no television, no computer. Just sitting there in the dark of his own home, with the curtains wide open, like a man who wanted to be seen, but did not know how to ask.
Marcus was 17 years old, the kind of teenager who was invisible to adults in the way that all teenagers assume they are. He lived 4 blocks away and had a girlfriend named Jenna, whose parents worked the night shift, which meant Marcus walked home from her house every night between midnight and 1 in the morning. He took the same route every time, past the Lerner house, because it was the fastest way, and because he had grown used to seeing David sitting in that bright window. At first it had creeped him out, the way David would stare straight ahead without moving, like a mannequin dressed in sweatpants and a gray t-shirt. But after a while, Marcus started to find it almost comforting. The one light on in a neighborhood of dark houses, the one person awake while everyone else slept. He would nod as he walked by, though David never nodded back. He would think, there's that guy again, still sitting there, still watching nothing. On the night of April 12th, 2002, Marcus left Jenna's house just after 12:30 in the morning. It was a clear night, cool for spring, the kind of night where the street lights cast sharp shadows and every sound carried. He turned onto Willow Ridge Drive and saw the Lerner house up ahead, the living room light glowing yellow as always. But something was different. David was not in his chair. The chair was empty, pushed back slightly, as if he had stood up in a hurry. And there was a second light on in the room, a light Marcus had never seen before, coming from the hallway that led to the bedrooms.
Then he saw movement. A shadow crossed the window, a figure that was not David, shorter and broader, moving fast. Marcus stopped walking. He stood there on the sidewalk, frozen, as the shadow crossed again, and then David came into view, backing into the living room with his hands raised. Marcus could not hear anything through the glass, but he could see David's mouth moving, saying something over and over. And then the second figure stepped into the light, and Marcus saw a man in a dark jacket raise his arm, and saw something glint in his hand, and saw David fall sideways out of the frame.
Marcus ran. He ran to the nearest house, the Jenkins place, and pounded on the door until Mr. Jenkins came down in his bathrobe. He told him everything, gasping, pointing toward the Lerner house, and Mr. Jenkins called 911. The police arrived in 7 minutes. They surrounded the house, flashlights drawn, and knocked on the front door. And then David Lerner opened the door. He was alive. He was uninjured. He was in his sweatpants and his gray t-shirt, and he looked tired, but otherwise fine. He told the officers that he had been sitting in his chair all night. He had not heard any noise. He had not seen any intruder. He had not fallen. He had not been attacked. He had no idea why a teenager would make up such a story, but teenagers did that sometimes, did they not? Marcus stood on the sidewalk, watching through the window as David spoke calmly to the police, and he felt something inside him crack, because he knew what he had seen. He knew that shadow. He knew that glint. And he knew that David was lying. The police filed a report, but took no further action. Marcus went home and did not sleep. He walked past the Lerner house the next night, and David was back in his chair, the curtains wide open, the yellow lamp glowing. Marcus walked faster. He took a different route after that, a longer one, because he could not stand to see that empty face staring out at the street as if nothing had happened. The neighborhood went back to normal, or what passed for normal in Willow Ridge. The Lerners still went to the grocery store, Emily still waved at cars, David still sat in his chair with the curtains open. And no one, not the police, not the neighbors, not even Jenna, believed Marcus. A month later, the for sale sign went up on the Lerners' lawn. The moving truck came on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday, the house was empty. Marcus watched from the corner as a woman he had never seen before, probably David's mother or an aunt, helped Emily into a sedan. David loaded boxes into a van. They drove away, and that was the last time anyone in Willow Ridge saw them. The house stayed on the market for 5 months. A young couple, Kevin and Rachel, bought it in the fall. They painted the living room. They replaced the carpet. They hung their own curtains, which they kept closed because that was what normal people did. And then, 6 weeks after moving in, Rachel decided to refinish the hardwood floors in the hallway that led to the bedrooms. She rented a sander from the hardware store and started on the section near the wall. That is when she noticed that a small rectangle of the floor looked different from the rest. It was slightly darker, slightly raised, as if someone had cut out a piece and patched it badly. She called Kevin over. He knelt down and pressed on the wood, and it moved. It lifted, and underneath it, there was a crawl space, a shallow gap between the floor and the foundation, the kind of space used for storage or ductwork. But there was no ductwork down there. There was a duffel bag. And inside the duffel bag, wrapped in a blue tarp and sealed with plastic, was the body of a man. The police came back to Willow Ridge, this time with dogs and cameras and evidence markers. They dug up the crawl space and found more than the duffel bag. They found a second set of bones, smaller, older, buried in the dirt beneath the foundation. They found a hammer with residue that matched both remains. And they found, wedged between 2 floor joists, a single child's drawing of a stick figure family with the words "Daddy and Me" written in unsteady handwriting. The drawing was dated 1999, the year David Lerner moved in. The bodies were identified as a man in his early 30s and a woman in her late 20s. Neither had ever been reported missing. Neither had any connection to David Lerner that the police could find. The crawl space had been sealed since the house was built in 1995, which meant that whoever put those bodies there had to have cut through the floor themselves. And the only person who had lived in that house long enough to do it, the only person who had spent night after night sitting alone in that bright living room with the curtains wide open, was David. The investigation traced David to a small town in Oregon where he was living under a different name with his daughter, now 9 years old. He was arrested in his living room, sitting in an armchair by a window with the curtains wide open. The police found no evidence that Emily had been harmed. They found no evidence that she knew anything about the crawl space or the bodies or the hammer. She told the officers that her daddy sometimes worked in the hallway at night with the door closed and that he told her never to come in. She said she never did. David Lerner was convicted of 2 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 40 years. He never explained who the victims were. He never explained why he killed them. He never explained why he sat in front of that window every night for months, watching the street, waiting for someone to notice. The prosecution argued that he was a predator who had killed strangers and hidden them beneath his floor. The defense offered no alternative. Marcus testified at the trial, now 19 years old, and still haunted by what he had seen. He told the jury about the shadow, the glint, the fall. He told them about watching David open the door that night, calm and unharmed, lying to the police with a face that showed nothing. He told them that he had spent 5 years wondering if he had imagined it. And then he looked at David across the courtroom and said, "I did not imagine it." David did not look back. He was staring straight ahead, the way he always had, at nothing.
The neighborhood changed after that. The house on Willow Ridge Drive sat empty for 2 years before it was finally demolished. No one wanted to live there, not after what they found beneath the floor. Marcus moved away. Jenna married someone else. The Jenkins family sold their house and left. And the only thing that remained, the only thing that stayed, was the memory of that yellow window glowing in the dark, and the man who sat inside it, watching the street with the curtains wide open, waiting for someone to see what he had done. You think about this story, and you realize that the scariest part is not the bodies in the crawl space or the hammer or the silence. It is the window. It is the fact that David Lerner sat there night after night, exposed, visible, inviting the world to look, and the world looked away. Marcus saw something. Marcus tried to tell someone, but David had already figured out the most important truth about being a monster in a quiet suburb, which is that no one wants to believe the thing they see. They want to believe the curtains are closed. They want to believe the father is harmless. They want to believe that the teenager is lying. Because the alternative is that we have been walking past a window for months, years, and we have never really looked. And maybe that is the warning in all of this. Maybe the most dangerous people are not the ones who hide in the dark. They are the ones who sit in plain sight, in the bright yellow light, with the curtains wide open, counting on you to walk by without really seeing. So the next time you pass a house with the lights on late at night, do not look away. Do not tell yourself it is nothing. Because sometimes the window is not an invitation. It is a confession.